Hey listeners, thanks for dropping in. I'm Christie.
And I'm Melissa. And this is Buried Motives, where we dig deep into the details of some of the most gruesome
dirtbag murderers.
Hey listeners.
Welcome back to Buried Motives.
We are happy you're here this week, and we are super happy for the reviews that we've been getting. And we're hoping that a few more of you will send in reviews.
Because that really helps us out. The other thing that can help us grow as a podcast is to follow us wherever you're listening to us. On Spotify, Apple, or whatever other platform.
It really does help because we like to bring you cases, and that support helps keep us going.
And the other thing that helps keep us going is the donations to our snack pantry. So thank you to everyone who has done that.
Some of you have been super generous, and we certainly appreciate it.
And we're shouting you out.
You know who you are.
You do. And we do appreciate it. We always have a snack every time we're recording, and it really does help. Because sometimes it's an all-day ordeal, believe it or not, by the time we take care of business and record. But speaking of getting down to business, I think we should get into this case. Because you guys, I think I might have found a case where I could be a fence sitter.
What?
Yes. If you know us, Melissa tends to be the one to sit on a fence post from time to time, and I typically feel more strongly one way or another. In today's case, I am not 100% convinced that they got the right guy.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, now I'm like super excited to hear this case. You are never a fence sitter.
I am never. And I thought, oh, Melissa, I'm doing this one for you, babe.
We usually have to tone down each of our, either my fence sitting or your determinedness of what's actually happened.
It's true. But I really am not 100% sure for this one. It took 40 years for police to make an arrest and send their guy to prison for a horrific murder. I can see why they eventually made this arrest, but I just don't feel comfortable with the level of evidence that they had for doing so.
Do you think they got tunnel visioned?
Well, it's hard to say because it took 40 years, but I do think they had tunnel vision.
Huh. It's easy to find evidence that fits your story once your story has been cemented in your brain.
Yes, but this is a bit of a wild roller coaster when it comes to the evidence, and I'm going to go through it with you. Either way, this case is tragic. Either the killer is still free and they sent the wrong man to prison, or they finally got the right guy, but he got to go on living his lousy life for 40 years before being held accountable. So either way, it's not a win. And I am really curious, Melissa, what your take will be on this case. Maybe you won't be a fence sitter. Maybe it will be a complete role reversal for us.
Maybe, but I'm feeling like I need to take out the notepad and pen and keep track of my thoughts.
And you can do that.
Okay, hold on.
She's not allowed to have her laptop open anymore when we record because she'll get distracted, but we do have a notepad and paper for her.
I am easily distractible, people.
She just loves the rabbit holes is all.
I love research. That's what it is.
That's why you're good at this. So today I'm going to start this case with the victim and her family. Kathleen Rose Schlosser was born on April 14th, 1952 in Mount Clemens, Macomb County, Michigan. Her family and friends called her Cathy, so that is how I will refer to her. Cathy grew up in Mount Clemens alongside her 5 siblings, but I'm unsure of her birth order. I do know that she had some younger siblings, so I think she was somewhere in the middle. Cathy's mother was Anna Teresa Zablocki. Anna, at age 20, married Cathy's father, Robert Edwin Schlosser, a truck driver who was 21 at the time, on February 29th, 1949, 3 years before Cathy was born. Cathy was one of those people who was described as, quote, lighting up a room. She was outgoing and made friends easily, and when she did make a friend, they were lucky to know her. Cathy was very caring and kind.
Oh man, this sounds like last week.
I know, I did think of that.
Always the best people.
And it shouldn't be.
No.
It shouldn't be any people, but it seems to make it extra tragic when they are such good people.
Mm-hmm.
One of Cathy's friends described her as being, quote, full of energy and life. She was beautiful on the inside and out. Cathy was smart and did well in school. She also encouraged her younger siblings to do their best scholastically as well. One of Cathy's younger sisters later said that Cathy encouraged her to go to college starting at a young age. This sister said about Cathy, quote, "She was my everything." During school, Cathy was involved in various extracurricular activities, including being a member of the Queen's Court. When Cathy was in high school, she met her future husband, Jim. After graduation, while attending Western Michigan University together, the two started dating and were described as the all-American couple. They knew each other in high school but didn't start dating till college.
You can see how this is playing out to be like a fairy tale, though.
Totally. Jim was only 5 months older than Cathy, but I think 1 grade ahead of her. He was born on November 12, 1951, also in Michigan. Although everyone who knew him called him Jim, he was given the full name of James Frederick Krauseneck Jr. Jim's father, James Frederick Krauseneck Sr., took over the family business, Krauseneck Carpet and Rugs, with his brother Harold, after their father died in 1949. So this is Jim's father.
Mm-hmm.
This family-run carpet business was in Mount Clemens and was said to be a thriving carpet shop. And I believe it is still running, but is now called Krauseneck Carpet 1 Floor and Home. I looked at the website, and it says that it has been in business for 150 years, which is impressive.
That is very impressive.
You can still go there.
What's more impressive is that it sounds like it's been family run for 150 years.
Yes, 3 generations.
That's crazy.
Mm-hmm. When I looked more into it, it seems that Jim's grandfather first purchased interest in the business when it was a department store from his uncle in 1880, but then became the sole owner in 1901, and at some point became a flooring store. Jim's mother was Pauline Alice Pringnitz. Pauline graduated from the same university where Jim and Cathy started dating, which I thought was actually super cool for a woman in the 1940s.
Mm-hmm.
I did a little digging, and in 1950, only 1.2% of American women went to college at that time.
Oh, that is impressive then.
Yeah, so go Pauline. I thought that was quite remarkable. James Sr. and Pauline were high school sweethearts and raised their family in the Presbyterian Church. Pauline was also active with the Cancer Society and Mount Clemens Art Center. Although both Cathy and Jim grew up in a working middle-class society, it seems to me that Jim lived a slightly more lavish lifestyle than Cathy. That being said, Jim did have a summer job at the local country club as a caddy and lifeguard. Jim was tall, dark, and handsome, and Cathy was an effervescent blonde beauty. They were a match made in heaven.
My goodness, this is a fairy tale.
It is. She's this bubbly blonde, gorgeous woman, and he's this tall, handsome dude who has a little bit of money, worked as a lifeguard. They're both going to school, living their best lives.
Working at the country club.
Right? The natural progression for these two lovebirds was to get married. Inside a church in Mount Clemens, Jim and Cathy were married on May 3rd, 1974. The wedding was described as fancy, fit for a princess. No one in attendance at the wedding knew that only 8 short years later, they would be gathering at this same chapel to attend Cathy's funeral.
That is sad that they happen at the same place.
Yeah.
Such a contrast.
The best day and the worst day. The newlyweds continued post-secondary school until Cathy earned a bachelor's degree and Jim earned a master's. In 1975, the couple moved to Fort Collins in Colorado so Jim could attend graduate school. Cathy worked as an orthopedic therapist. Sadly, soon after moving, Cathy suffered a miscarriage. Cathy and Jim clung to one another to help them get through this tragedy. 3 years later, the Krausenecks would get their miracle. Cathy gave birth to a little girl whom they named Sarah on April 15, 1978, just 1 day after Cathy's 26th birthday. Both Cathy and Jim quickly fell in love with their only child. From 1978 to 1979, Jim worked towards earning his PhD. After finishing his doctoral dissertation, they moved, and Jim began teaching economics at Lynchburg College in Virginia. He worked there from 1979 to 1981. However, although everyone called him Doctor, Jim technically didn't earn his PhD. He submitted his dissertation, but it was returned for him to revise, and he never ended up resubmitting it, so it technically wasn't complete. But Jim let everyone believe that he had been awarded this doctorate. And I question why he just didn't fix his dissertation and hand it back in.
Yeah, that's weird.
He was right at the finish line. But we also know when you have a brand new baby, life gets in the way, you're working, and was it one of those things that just got put on the back burner and then it was kind of too late?
Did he just forget about it?
There wasn't a lot said about it, but he just never resubmitted it, which just seems like a waste.
It does seem like a waste, but really odd that he would then continue to call himself a doctor when he actually wasn't.
Right. Everyone thought that he had finished it.
Was he all about status?
No, I don't think so. He was actually described as a pretty humble man.
Okay.
And I'm unsure if Cathy knew that her husband didn't actually earn his doctorate. A few sources claim that she had no idea.
Okay. Huh. That is weird.
It is weird, and there's a few weird things about this case. That's the first one. Perhaps now that they had a little one to care for, Cathy and Jim agreed that Jim needed to find a higher paying job. He had asked for a raise at the college, but they denied his request. I guess his pay was within their parameters. Claiming that he did have a PhD, Jim was able to get a better paying job at Eastman Kodak as an economist in 1981.
Okay, so that explains why he lied about the PhD. He needed more money.
Probably. And it was going to help him land this better job.
Mm-hmm.
With a new job, it was time to get a new house to settle into to raise their family. With help from Jim's family, I'm assuming from their thriving carpet business, Jim and Cathy were able to purchase a very nice home on Del Rio Drive in the quiet suburb of Rochester, New York, called Brighton. The happy family moved to Brighton in September of 1981. Cathy was described as a devoted mother to Sarah. Together, Cathy and Jim would take Sarah on bike rides and walks around the neighborhood. Sarah was now 3 years old. She was in dance class and enrolled in Queen of Peace Nursery School not far from where they lived. Jim would drive the family vehicle to work every day, but Cathy kept busy with Sarah. She had even taken her sledding the day before her death and had plans to take her to the circus that upcoming weekend. But sadly, they would never make it to this planned family outing. I'm going to tell you right away, as I get into the murder and investigation details, that the police suspect Jim of Cathy's murder. And I want to say this now so that we can look at the evidence objectively right from the start. On Friday, February 19th, 1982, Jim got up as per usual and got ready for work. Cathy and Sarah were asleep when he left at 6:30 a.m. Jim spent the day at work and returned home at 4:50 p.m. When he pulled up to his family home, he noticed that the garage door was open. When Jim got out, he discovered that the glass of the front door was broken and a maul was sitting by the door. And a maul is typically like a sledgehammer. This one in particular was the type that was more so 2 tools in one. So it had a splitting axe on one side and a sledgehammer on the other. So this is likely what they used to break the glass.
Right.
The lower right pane of the glass on the door had been broken, near where the door handle would have been. Broken glass was on the ground, and the maul, like I said, was resting against the wall perpendicular to the door.
Was the glass inside or outside?
It was both, actually. There was glass everywhere.
Okay.
Yeah. It wasn't like a staged being broken from inside the house.
Gotcha.
They believed it was broken from the outside. Because I thought that too. But after making this discovery, rightfully alarmed, Jim ran into his house. He couldn't see his wife or daughter, so he ran upstairs to the home's primary room and made the worst discovery of his life. Laying on their marital bed was his wife, Cathy. She was clearly deceased. She had an axe still embedded in her head.
Ooh.
She was only 29 years old.
That's an interesting choice for a weapon.
Yes.
Seems personal.
It does. But we're also going to talk about the contradiction of that weapon choice.
Was it an axe from the home?
Yes. We'll get into all of that.
Okay.
I promise I'm going to give you all the information I have. Thankfully, Jim was able to quickly find Sarah in the next room, completely unharmed. Jim scooped his daughter up in his arms and fled the house. He ran straight to the neighbor's house across the street for help. Jim's neighbor would later say that Jim showed up to their home, quote, clutching Sarah in his arms, and with the, quote, look of terror on his face. What stood out to me about this was that Jim ran across the street. To me, this would seem like he was so distressed that he just ran straight out of the house until he reached help. He did not process going right next door where the house was likely closer. The neighbor let Jim and Sarah into their home and immediately called the police. Jim could hardly speak, but the neighbor told the 911 dispatcher that they believed someone was murdered across the street. Jim had managed to mutter out enough words to suggest that Cathy might be dead. Was Jim traumatized and in shock, or was he just a really good actor? By 5:03 p.m., only about 13 minutes after Jim got home from work, police arrived at the scene. One of the detectives who arrived at the Krauseneck home said that Jim could only cry and moan when he was first spoken to. Upon investigation of the house, What is more shocking than the evidence found at the scene was the lack thereof. It seemed like there was very little forensic evidence inside the Krausenecks' home. The murder weapon did belong to the Krausenecks, but it was kept in the garage, and the intruder would have walked right past it. It is not uncommon for a dirtbag to use a weapon of convenience once they enter someone's home. We have actually covered multiple cases where this has happened, so this wasn't necessarily curious to me. What was curious to me about the axe was that it didn't have any fingerprints on it. At all. Not even Jim's, who often used this axe to chop wood.
With gloves on, though?
That I'm not sure.
I use gloves when I'm chopping wood.
But would you never get a fingerprint on the axe? When you take off the gloves, do you move your axe or you put it down and then take off your gloves? I'm not sure. But investigators thought that this suggested that the axe was wiped clean. And I thought, did the murderer wipe it down first and wear gloves? Or heaven forbid, did they wipe it down while it was still lodged in Cathy's head?
A disturbing thought.
But it was very odd. They could not find any fingerprint anywhere on this axe.
That is weird.
Mm-hmm. Along with the axe not having fingerprints on it, it was hard for investigators to find fingerprints in the house at all. Nor did they find any odd fibers. If this was a random murder, then the perp took a lot of time and care into erasing any sign that they were there. If this was an inside job, then why bother wiping down your own prints that would be expected to be found inside your home?
Yeah, neither one of those scenarios makes sense.
No, because if you're killing your wife, it doesn't matter if your fingerprints are on the bathroom door handle. You live there.
They could find no fingerprints at all anywhere in the house.
Hardly.
She was a really good housekeeper.
And maybe she was. Or did the perp panic afterwards and clean everything?
Everything, though? That's a hard scenario to believe.
Right. It's another one of those weird facts of this case.
Like, you wouldn't think that they would wipe down any areas that they hadn't gone into. And if you're going in to kill somebody, you're not lounging in the rec room or going down to the basement or anywhere like that.
It's true. So maybe she did just keep a very clean house, but it was odd.
That is odd.
I know there would be a lot of fingerprints around my house that you can't see.
Especially with a 3-year-old.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah. But if it was Jim, why would you even wipe it down in the first place?
Exactly.
And I'm not saying that they didn't find any, but they hardly found any.
An unusually small amount that they recognized it.
Correct. Police surmised that the house looked like it had been staged to look like a robbery. One of the officers who worked on the case later said that in Brighton, they did not handle a lot of homicides, but they did handle a lot of robberies. So it was clear to them that this situation was not a robbery gone bad. Valuable items were left sitting out, including cash. Cathy's purse was on the floor in the dining room with its contents thrown about, along with other expensive items. I looked at crime scene photos. There is a particular photo that became controversial during the investigation and led authorities to believe that the scene was staged. Let me describe this photo to you. On the carpeted dining room floor, there is a silver tea set. There are a few items belonging to the tea set properly placed on 2 silver platters. The silver teapot is sitting also upright on the floor between them, and 2 silver candelabras are tipped over, also right next to the platters.
Are they having a tea party on the floor?
That's what I thought, but we'll get to that. Beside the expensive tea set items is a black garbage bag. Inside of the trash bag, there was a faint shoe print discovered, which we will put a pin in right now, but we will come back to that shoe print. But first, let's keep discussing the tea set. Why was everything but the candles sitting upright? If I was going to steal stuff, I would just chuck stuff into the bag as fast and haphazardly as I could. I wouldn't collect the items neatly first in a pile on the floor. If this was staged, they did a really obvious job at it. Throwing the plastic bag beside it to look like they were possibly interrupted mid-robbery is almost comical if this was baloney. And, just like you thought, maybe because I'm a girl mom, the thought occurred to me that perhaps the tea set was on the floor so nicely because Cathy was playing with Sarah. Sarah was 3.5 years old at the time, the perfect age for a tea party.
Yeah, I can totally see that happening.
Did they play and just leave the items sitting out from the night before? But nobody else seemed to have this thought, and I didn't see the crime scene in person, but this tea set thing really did not make sense to me. As a mom, my reaction was they were probably playing. Because who's going to stage it that bad? To just set it down nicely?
Exactly.
If it was Jim, he was a smart man. He would know that that's not what a robbery is going to look like. But police took this to believe, oh, it's a staged robbery.
Okay. But was that the only evidence? Because there was more evidence that there was a staged robbery.
Well, her purse was on the ground with its contents strewn about. But if someone did come in, possibly she tried to hit them with the purse and stuff flew out and it went across the room.
Okay.
To me, that could be a sign of a struggle, not necessarily a staged robbery.
And there was nothing else inside the garbage bag?
Nothing. It was an empty garbage bag laying on the floor beside it.
Like a brand new garbage bag?
Yes, a black trash bag.
Huh.
Nothing in it that I could find in any of the reports. And when I looked at the photo, it didn't look like anything was in there. But inside, they found this partial shoe print. But could there have been someone who she confronted in that area who had the bag? The bag fell when she hit them with the purse? I don't know. But you and I seem to be the only people who thought of a tea party.
That seems to be the logical explanation to me, if it's all set out so nicely on the floor with a 3-year-old in the house.
Yeah, and just the candles were tipped over. And my thought was, if it was later in the evening, they're playing this tea party, and she's like, okay, Sarah, it's time for your bath or it's time for bed. When she got up to run out of the room, she could have easily knocked those candles over.
Right.
Because they were tall and clunky.
Mm-hmm. But do you let a 3-year-old play with an expensive silver set?
If you're playing with them, if she was sitting there with them.
Yeah.
And they are an affluent family. Probably didn't have a cheap tea set. I don't know. But because it was there so carefully, I would assume they were playing together. Mm-hmm. If that even was. Maybe it was a staged robbery. I really don't know with this case. Because things seemed odd, and because it's quote-unquote always the husband, police decided to narrow their search towards Jim for his wife's murder. Detective Bill Flood interviewed little Sarah the same night that her mother was found. The second most horrific thing about this case is that Sarah had spent the entire day inside her home with her mother's dead body.
Oh, she had been dead for some time. She could have got it down all by herself then.
Oh, she could have after. I never even thought of that.
Yeah. What did she do for all those hours?
I don't know. Because she really was just stuck in the house.
So she could have went through her mom's purse too.
Oh, yes. I never even thought of that.
But they found no fingerprints of a 3-year-old all over the house?
All it said was there was very little fingerprints found.
Okay.
And no odd fibers. There was really so much lack of evidence in this case. When interviewed, Sarah told the detective that there was a quote-unquote bad man. She said that the man had a hammer in his head, and then she said he had an axe in his head. She described the man as having quote-unquote many colors on his face. Police felt that Sarah hadn't actually seen a man, but was telling them about her mother, who was covered in blood. That she likely didn't recognize Cathy as her mom.
Okay, I could see that.
Mm-hmm.
And because, oh no, it was the mall that had the hammer and the axe.
Right.
That is interesting. But she said in the head, not in the hand.
She said in the head.
Okay.
Which is just heartbreaking, because that means that Sarah went into the room and saw her mom laying there.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah also said that when she woke up, she couldn't find Mommy or Daddy to help her get dressed or make her breakfast. But a bad man was in Mommy and Daddy's bed. So if she's talking about breakfast, maybe she was thinking a tea party. Like, I'm going to make food.
Right. But the bad man in her bed makes me think that it is her mom that she's referring to.
Oh, I do think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think she actually saw whoever did this. Thankfully. It's bad enough that she saw her mom.
Yeah.
And her brain just had to dissociate it, as that's a bad man in there.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, though, that she said a bad man and not a bad woman.
Yeah, it's true. The following day, February 20th, Jim gave a second interview to the police and agreed to be interviewed a third time later that same day. This was also the day that Cathy's autopsy was performed. The cause of death was clear. Cathy had died from the axe wound to her head. She died instantly on impact. It was also reported, thankfully, that there was no evidence of a sexual assault before Cathy died. Based on her body temperature when she was found, Cathy's time of death was said to have occurred sometime between 4:30 and 7:30 a.m. This meant that there would have only been a 1-hour window after Jim left for work for the murder to have taken place if he didn't do it.
Okay. Time of death, we know, though, isn't an exact science.
It isn't. And we're going to talk a lot about the time of death, actually. When police went back to ask Jim more questions, he was gone. He took Sarah and went to be with his family in Michigan. Was this suspicious? Maybe. Or did he just need support from his loved ones and it slipped his mind? Also maybe. It was believed that Jim's parents drove up from Michigan and talked him into coming back to Michigan with them.
Which seems like a logical thing or a plausible thing that his parents would do. Come, let us take care of you.
Yeah, don't worry about that. Just come with us. Police did catch up to Jim in Michigan shortly afterwards, and Jim agreed to provide police with hair and blood samples to help the investigation. So he was being extremely cooperative. So it didn't seem to me like he was just trying to get out of Dodge.
You don't go to Michigan to get out of Dodge. You go the extra step and you go into Canada, or you go south and you go to Mexico.
Right. Yeah, it's not evading the police by going to your parents' house.
No, that's a very logical place to find you.
Yeah, especially when your parents have come to collect you.
Mm-hmm.
Police continued to investigate Cathy's murder, but they struggled to find any concrete evidence to tie Jim to the murder. They also couldn't find any real evidence to suggest that someone else did it. As a result, the case went cold, and aside from a few blips, it essentially stayed resting on ice for nearly 4 decades. This means that either Jim got away with murder, or there was another cold-blooded killer out there unbeknownst to the police.
I have to say that I might have a bias in this case because I love the movie The Fugitive, and it wasn't the husband that time.
That's true. Yeah, I'm really struggling with the idea that Jim did this, and maybe it's just because I don't want to believe it. I don't know. Jim continued on and started to rebuild his life with Sarah. He ended up getting married a couple of more times before finding a long-term love. I read in a couple of reports that Jim married in 1986, so 4 years after Cathy's murder. This marriage essentially ended the day after Sarah's 7th birthday. Jim was said to just up and leave with his daughter. Jim had told people that he married this woman to try and provide his daughter with a mother. But after her birthday, it is believed that Jim got spooked about how close Sarah was getting with this woman, and so he left. To me, if this is his real reason, this could suggest that he was still traumatized over Cathy and couldn't bear to see her be replaced. And also remember that Sarah's and Cathy's birthdays were only a day apart, so he would have been thinking about Cathy every time they celebrated Sarah's birthday.
There was no problems with the relationship before the birthday?
Not really.
A weird behavior or a knee-jerk reaction then?
People speculated that he was seeing Cathy getting replaced by his new wife.
Okay, but that's a conversation you have with your wife about how you're struggling with this. It's not we're running off and ending the relationship. And it was her 7th birthday, so it's the same year?
Yeah.
Okay.
So they were not married very long. Oh, he had marriage regret, maybe. Buyer's remorse? I don't know.
It's interesting. Seems like an overreaction, though.
It does. But my spouse has never been killed in the head with an axe and have had to experience this either.
Right. And I get the initial reaction of, I just need to get out of here. But then you talk it over even a week or 2 weeks later. Like, this is why I behave this way. This is how I'm understanding this situation. I'm not comfortable with it. Maybe we need to work things through.
Right.
But to just end things so suddenly, maybe we just don't know that they had conversations about that later.
Maybe. There was very little information about this marriage.
Okay.
Just that it was short-lived and this is what had happened. And it was his trauma response.
Mm-hmm. It seems like it.
Yeah.
But you can have a trauma response from feeling guilty too.
Mm-hmm. You could. Yeah, it could have just been a giant dirtbag move. Years later, Jim married another woman, Gail Labram, on May 12, 1992 in King County, Washington. And I couldn't find any information about this marriage, only that it lasted 5 years. Jim and Gail divorced in 1997. By the time of this marriage, in the early 1990s, Jim had moved from Washington State and had joined a subsidiary of Weyerhaeuser, a Fortune 500 company. He bounced from California to Georgia and then settled back to Washington to work at the company's corporate headquarters. In 1997, while at a trade show, Jim ran into an old friend, a woman named Sharon James. Soon the two began dating, and 2 years later, on November 20th, 1999, the pair were married in Clark, Nevada. Sharon was his 4th and final wife. 10 years after getting married, Jim and Sharon purchased a beautiful French country-style house in Gig Harbor near Tacoma in Washington. At this home, it was said that the couple were living out Jim and Cathy's dream. The house had 4 bedrooms and multiple fireplaces, including one in the primary room. The lawns on the property were perfectly manicured, and they lived in view of the golf course at the Canterbury Country Club. Jim would commute 23 miles each day to his well-paying job at Weyerhaeuser. Life was good. Along with family and work life, Jim was part of the steering committee for Harvard University's Joint Center for Housing Studies. as well as on the board of directors of the Southern Forest Pine Association. At this point, Jim's parents, Jim Sr. and Pauline, moved to Gig Harbor to be closer to Jim, Sarah, and Sharon. They actually lived just around the corner from them. When Jim reached retirement, around 2012, he and Sharon purchased a second home in Scottsdale, Arizona. When Jim retired, he held the position of Vice President of Marketing and Sales in the Softwoods division of Weyerhaeuser. Sarah grew up in a loving home. She eventually had 2 daughters of her own and was living in Texas. And a little fun fact, Sarah's second daughter was born on what would have been Cathy's 62nd birthday.
Oh, that's sweet.
Also in 2012, while Jim was retiring, Cathy's murder case would experience an unexpected turn of events.
After so long.
Yes, because this would have been 30 years after. A dirtbag, career criminal, confessed to her murder. And no, it was not Jim. A man named Edward Larrabee confessed to Cathy's murder while he was already incarcerated for other crimes that he had committed. Edward was a violent, convicted sex offender who at the time of the murder lived just down the road from the Krausenecks. I believe only about a mile away. It was reported that it was only a short 4-minute walk. But he lived right there. At the time of his confession, Edward was locked up for attempted murder, sexual abuse, and robbery, and had had dozens of various charges before this. It was like 34 convictions he had had.
Convictions?
Yes.
Wow. He definitely has a patterned history.
Yes.
Breaking and entering.
Attempted murder, sexual abuse, all of it.
There were no signs of sexual abuse.
There wasn't.
But he could have been scared off by a 3-year-old.
Totally. While in prison, Edward told police that he had murdered 2 women. The woman in Brighton with an axe in 1982, as well as a music teacher, Stephanie Kupczynski, in 1991. Edward had been diagnosed with ALS. ALS is a fatal type of motor neuron disease. It causes progressive degeneration of nerve cells in the spinal cord and brain. This would not be an easy way to go. He confessed after he knew he was going to die. And Edward did die just 2 years after his confession. So was this essentially a deathbed confession?
Was he hoping that they would convict him and give him the death penalty?
No. It was said by, I believe, a lawyer about Edward that he was a, quote, notorious self-described sociopathic killer of women. You might think, aha, case closed. But no, police didn't believe Edward. In his written confession, Edward got some of the facts wrong.
After 30 years.
Yes, exactly.
They didn't believe his confession for either of the murders or just Cathy's?
I'm not 100% sure, but I think they believed his confession for the other woman.
Interesting.
I'm thinking tunnel vision here. In his confession, Edward had said that the woman who he murdered with the axe in Brighton was heavy-set and had brown hair. Cathy was blonde and had a slim build. Edward also said that before he killed her, he sexually assaulted her. Cathy's autopsy indicated that there hadn't been any sexual abuse done to her prior to her murder. Police decided that Edward must be lying and didn't investigate his claims any further.
There are 2 pretty big things to get wrong and not remember.
True. And we do know that dirtbags will sometimes confess to crimes that they did not commit for notoriety. We also know that some dirtbags who have made careers out of breaking the law could get incidents mixed up and or forget some of the facts. Edward was giving a confession 30 years after Cathy's death.
What did the other woman look like? Do you know? That he said he murdered? Did he just get the 2 of them mixed up?
That I'm not sure. But they were quite some time apart, too. But my guess is he probably did attack a brunette, heavier-set woman and had raped her in Brighton around that time.
Was there reports of that, though?
They didn't investigate it.
Oh.
They just said, oh, he's wrong on these facts. He's not our guy. They really just dropped the ball on it. I would think after 30 years, having someone confess, you would want to really dig deep into that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Because this man was not trying to confess to get out of prison. He knew he was going to spend his last days there, and he was terminally ill.
Did he just want more attention? Was he an attention seeker?
I didn't read that. But what I did read is that some people think that Edward was confessing to things he didn't do to get special things in prison, like pizza.
Oh.
Like, oh, if you get me a pizza, I'll confess something to you.
Dirtbags have been known to do that.
They have.
There was one that confessed to like 100 different murders because there was a cop that would give special privileges to people that confessed to him. He was known to collect over 100 confessions And then people were confessing to him for the extra perks. They didn't actually commit those crimes. One of the serial killers said that he had committed 100 murders and he had only done like 3.
Right.
That he knew the details too.
And so maybe he did think, oh, I'm not getting out of here alive anyways, so I might as well confess. But then why not confess to a bunch, only 2? Is that worth 2 pizzas?
And interestingly, maybe he was just living there at the time and he heard about the murder and that's why he kind of remembered that one.
Could have, because he did live just down the street. But either way, I do think that the police dropped the ball not to investigate this lead any further. Did he do it? I honestly don't know. Should the police have dropped his claims? What seems like so easily? I don't think so. Edward could have killed Cathy and was clearing his conscience after realizing that he was going to die in prison. Also, if fame is what he was after, why only confess to killing 2 women 9 years apart and not a bunch of them to be seen as a serial killer? Either way, Cathy's case once again went cold. In April of 2015, Cathy's case was officially reopened and the FBI became involved.
How did it reopen or why?
Well, the Brighton police chief at the time, Mark Henderson, ordered a review of the case.
Just this single case or were they doing the whole cold case review?
I did not read that they were doing like a mass look at cold cases.
Because I would think that tunnel vision is a little bit more likely if they were only looking at one case.
I didn't read that they were doing multiple.
Okay.
That it was like a campaign to work on cold cases, but possibly. It was just that the police chief at the time was like, I want us to relook at this case. The police traveled to conduct interviews. They spoke to potential witnesses, suspects, and people who they felt might have pertinent information. I imagine that this would have been a challenge so many years later. When Jim's coworkers were interviewed, police were given differing perspectives. Some people said that Jim was acting sketchy or off on the day of the murder, while other people said that he behaved in a typical manner. Nothing he did raised suspicion while he spent the entire day at work.
Wait, didn't they perform all these interviews at the very beginning?
They did, but they were re-interviewing people, trying to reopen the case.
Okay, so originally people were saying, yeah, he was acting sketchy.
Yeah, and some said he absolutely was not.
Okay.
But he definitely did spend the entire day at work. After a couple of months, in June of 2015, Police Chief Henderson and Police Captain Cathy arranged a meeting with the FBI Buffalo Cold Case Group. The parties met, and Cathy's case was presented and reviewed. The meetings ended with the decision that everything on the case would be handed over to the FBI to be digitized. After this, Cathy's family were informed that her case was being revisited. It would take almost another year before the authorities would once again interview Jim. He wasn't part of their initial re-investigation.
Mm-hmm.
In April of 2016, 2 Brighton investigators showed up at Jim and Sharon's home in Gig Harbor, Washington. They surprised them on a lazy Saturday afternoon. Sharon later said that Jim didn't think he needed a lawyer and willingly allowed the detectives into their home to answer their questions. The detectives had started the conversation saying that they think they knew who killed Cathy and needed his help, so he was happy to oblige. During this interview, one of the detectives outright asked Jim if he killed his wife or had anything to do with it. Jim stated clearly that he did not kill Cathy. In response, the detective looked at Jim and told him that he disagreed and that he believed he did it. If Jim was guilty, I hope he squirmed at this statement. But if he was innocent, how awful to be put through this all these years later.
It's interesting to me that the police didn't inform him that they were reopening his wife's murder. They only informed her family.
Yes.
And I think he would have been a logical person to ask right away once you've reopened the case. He's the person that found her. It would have been the first interview, would it not have been?
It should have been.
Okay.
It was another odd thing that I thought of this case.
But they were trying to surprise him with the information or work around him. So they're already thinking that he did it.
Oh, I think this whole time, because this has now taken well over a year or so, I think they're trying to build a case against him.
Mm-hmm.
And now they're coming to catch him off guard and spook him.
Right. Or else they would have informed him, along with Cathy's family, that the case had been reopened.
Correct. That's what I think.
What was the relationship like between him and Cathy's family?
I think it was pretty good.
Okay. Sorry. Interesting that they wouldn't tell him about the investigation then.
No, I think they had drifted apart.
Okay.
They do make some comments later that he had kind of moved on. This is now
30 years later.
More than that.
Yeah.
Yeah. At this time, one of the detectives said that when they alluded to the fact that they thought Jim killed Cathy, they could see him begin to breathe more rapidly. They thought this meant that he was guilty, because who would get nervous if you were innocent? And to that I say, me, sir. If you were coming to me saying, we think you did it and we're going to prove it, I would be nervous, even if I was innocent.
Yeah, there's different kinds of nervousness.
Right. But they had noticed, he was breathing more rapidly. So he must have done it.
Okay. That's quite the polygraph. And even those aren't reliable.
No, they're not.
Even just shock could make you breathe rapidly.
Oh, for sure. This was totally out of left field for them. They're having this lazy Saturday afternoon, retired, lounging around, spending the day with his wife. They're like, hey, we think we have figured things out. Can we come in? Yes, of course, come in. I'll answer whatever questions. And then, we think you did it and we're going to nail you. I might freak out a little.
It would be a start for sure.
Yeah. Authorities continued to work the case for another 2 years after this. In 2018, they found their so-called smoking gun when they contacted a high-profile prosecutor turned forensic pathologist, Dr. Michael Baden, to take a look at Cathy's case. Dr. Baden worked on the assassination of JFK as well as the reported suicide of Jeffrey Epstein. He was once the chief medical examiner for the state of New York. Being a big dog in this industry, Dr. Baden agreed to take a look at Cathy's case. On October 15th of the following year, 2019, Dr. Baden reported on his findings. His entire report would be based on Cathy's stomach contents and her time of death.
Is this the guy that did George Floyd's autopsy?
Yes, he worked on that case as well as OJ's.
Oh, interesting. So he is pretty high profile.
Definitely. Well, let's get into what he found. Apparently, there was an electric blanket on the Krauseneck's bed when Cathy was found. However, it was never officially recorded in any of the reports if the blanket was turned on or off at the time of the discovery of Cathy's body. If the blanket was left on, that would affect Cathy's body temperature and thus affect her official time of death. There had been an officer who stated that the blanket was turned off, but he had since passed away and could not be re-interviewed. But he had told people that the blanket was off.
Okay.
But it was not officially recorded. They kind of dismissed this whole idea that this other officer said it was turned off at the time because it wasn't technically written down.
Okay.
But he had said it was turned off, but Dr. Baden believes it was on.
Okay.
And so they're going to run with that.
Okay.
That the blanket had to have been turned on. Dr. Baden's report would later be submitted as evidence, so let me explain his conclusions. According to the court documents for this case, as a general rule of thumb, a dead body cools at around the rate of about 1.5 degrees per hour. This rate of cooling can be affected by numerous factors, heat and humidity to name just a couple. In Dr. Baden's report, he calculated Cathy's time of death using a cooling process of 1 degree per hour. He said he did this because she was found underneath an electric blanket, which he believed was turned on, and a comforter. To the best of my knowledge, Dr. Baden was the only forensic pathologist to come to this specific conclusion. No one else would agree on his findings. Other forensic pathologists during the second investigation actually believed that the window of Cathy's death was even wider, that she could have died anywhere between 5 o'clock a.m. and 1 o'clock p.m. But, according to Dr. Baden, Cathy had to have been murdered at 3:30 a.m. on February 19th, 1982.
That's very specific.
Extremely. The only person at home with Cathy at the time who could have killed her was her husband. Jim admitted that he never left the house until 6:30 that morning. 2 weeks after Dr. Baden's official findings, on November 1st, 2019, Jim Krauseneck was indicted. A week later, he surrendered himself to authorities at the Hall of Justice in Rochester, New York. He pleaded not guilty of Cathy's murder. So he didn't run, he went willingly.
I think I've heard his name before being in connection with his cases being questionable.
That's interesting.
But I'd have to do some research to actually know if my recall is correct.
We're not making any accusations, but along with that, like I said, it was odd to me that not one other forensic pathologist would agree with his findings. So did it take them so long to find this smoking gun of Michael Baden to make the findings fit their case?
It is curious. I am surprised that they're going to get a conviction on this evidence.
This is the main reason why they get a conviction, is this time of death.
But usually time of death is a time frame. It's not 3 a.m.
But I think he was so high profile. He's worked on all these big cases. This is what he's saying. even though the defense had pathologists testify to the opposite, that it was more likely between 5 in the morning and 1 o'clock in the afternoon, that we couldn't be certain that it was 3:30.
Right. But we see that all the time with cases where each side's going to have their own experts that testify to completely different things.
Right. But like you said at the beginning, it's not an exact science. So to say it likely happened at 3:30 in the morning when Jim was the only possible suspect is pretty ballsy of a statement.
Well, now I'm curious.
Well, I just don't think you can say it happened right at 3:30, 40 years later.
No.
When other officers were like, no, this officer said it was turned off. And he's like, nope, it was on. It was on. So we're going by the 1 degree cooling calculation. But I think he's just making it fit.
So I use an electric blanket when I go to bed at night. And I turn it on when I get into bed to warm up the bed, but it's never on in the morning.
No, I will do the same thing. You turn it on to heat up your bed.
Yeah.
And if I do have it on, if it's really cold, I will have it on the lowest setting, but often they have timers too, where they will turn off in the night.
Or for the amount of time that she was laying there. So how does anybody know? It's interesting that you get a conviction based on this fact that nobody could actually prove.
Again, this case is about the lack of evidence to me.
There's got to be another smoking gun. Where's the motive, Christie? Why do they think it's him?
We're going to talk about it. We're going to wrap it up pretty quick here. 40 years after Cathy's death, Jim was tried for her murder. His trial began in September of 2022, so not that long ago. As I mentioned, Dr. Baden's findings were a huge factor during the trial. But remember that I said that they originally found a shoe print inside the empty trash bag beside the silver tea set at the crime scene? Well, now the prosecution had a theory that they presented as evidence regarding that partial shoe print. The shoe print was examined by an expert witness. This expert stated that the shoe print was made from a specific type of footwear, a boat shoe. When crime scene photos were examined, there was a pair of boat shoes sitting beside Jim and Cathy's bed when she was found. To me, it looks like they were taken off possibly before hopping into bed. There was one shoe slightly in front of the other, like when you use one shoe to help remove the other, not just tossed into a corner. At the time of the murder, these boat shoes that belonged to Jim were never tested. There was no concrete evidence to say that this particular pair of boat shoes made the footprint. I'm not saying that these shoes didn't make that partial print. I am just saying that there was no proof of it, other than matching the type of footwear. I'm not a lawyer, but to me, this is circumstantial evidence.
Oh, absolutely.
But they're saying, oh, time of death, and his shoe is in the bag.
We don't even know how that bag got there.
No, it's like saying, if red lipstick was found at the scene, and this woman has red lipstick, oh, she must have done it. Without testing, is it a match to the red lipstick? When it came to motive, it was hard to understand why Jim would want his wife, the mother of his child, dead. From what I read, I could not find anything to suggest that Jim would benefit financially from Cathy's death. His family was already wealthy and he made good money. It also didn't appear that Jim had a sexy side piece. It took him years to get into another relationship. He also likely didn't kill her to avoid a divorce. He went on to get divorced 2 separate times afterwards. There are some who believe that Jim did have a motive. On February 16th, 1982, just 3 days before the murder, it was said that Kodak, the company that Jim had once worked for, had run a background check on him and discovered that he had not completed his PhD as he had said he had. People speculate that Cathy didn't know that her husband had been lying about his PhD, and so he killed her to prevent her from finding out.
That doesn't stop anybody else from finding out.
Right. It didn't seem logical to me that he would escalate to murder just so she wouldn't know. Because the background checks were being run, it was going to come out regardless. So is this grasping at straws, or was that his motive?
But we have seen other killers that will murder a person they love just not to let them down.
Look at John List.
Yeah.
Murdered his whole family.
That wouldn't be unheard of.
No, it's not. It just seems like a far jump for me. But it could have been.
It was a far jump for John List, too. But there was also lots of other secretive behaviors that he was carrying on, where this doesn't seem to be the case with Jim.
Yeah, I don't think he was being secretive. Other reports did state that their marriage was going through a tough time because of Jim's long work hours. This was supported by police finding a marriage counseling pamphlet inside their home. No marriage is perfect. We all experience challenges, and the fact that you are considering counseling is not necessarily a red flag. Maybe it's a green flag, showing that you are willing to put in the effort to save what you have together.
It's impressive that any man in the 70s would agree to counseling.
Right. And they hadn't started counseling, but there was just a pamphlet in their home about counseling.
Okay. So maybe things weren't as perfect as what people believe from the outside.
Right. But I sometimes might come home with a window cleaning pamphlet, and it doesn't mean I'm going to get my windows cleaned.
Okay. Good point.
Yeah. Or have you ever grabbed a pamphlet at the doctor's office to give to a friend? Who knows why that was there?
Right. But there were no reports from family at the time or friends that they were having problems.
Not really. I think there was one friend that was like, oh, yeah, they were having trouble. But again, that can change your perspective after the fact. And no marriage is perfect.
Mm-hmm.
So they didn't have this perfect marriage. But by all accounts, even Cathy's family thought they had a good relationship. They were not suspicious of Jim at the beginning. There wasn't much evidence to connect Jim to killing his wife. That being said, prosecutors would argue that the lack of outside evidence is evidence that Jim is a dirtbag and murdered his wife in the most brutal and vicious of ways. On the flip side of this, some people have analyzed that an axe attack is typically a more rageful killing and rarely stops at just one blow. Being murdered by an axe is not as common today as it was in the past, but when it did occur, it was usually by multiple blows. So if it was personal, they thought there would have been more than just the one hit. Jim was also a very educated man. If he was wanting to throw off the timeline of Cathy's death, why wouldn't he have pulled the electric blanket before fake discovering her body? He could have turned that on to mess with the time of death and then removed it completely so it wasn't even a factor. There was also the fact that Jim had never once been violent towards anyone leading up to Cathy's murder, especially towards Cathy or Sarah, and he was never once reported as being violent afterwards. On September 26, 2022, after 10 hours of deliberation, the jury for Jim's trial came back with a verdict. They found Jim guilty of second-degree murder for the slaying of his wife, Cathy Krauseneck. On November 7, 2022, Jim was given his sentence. At the age of 71, Jim was ordered to serve 25 years in prison.
I am shocked they got a conviction on that amount of evidence.
I am too. Sarah, Jim and Cathy's daughter, who was now 44 years old, attended the entire trial in support of her father. She did not believe for 1 second that her father killed her mother. Sarah's eyes, Jim was a good father to her and always had been. If he loved his daughter, could he really have murdered her mother and then left her inside the house with her dead body for over 10 hours? During the sentencing hearing, Sarah said, quote, "I've been blessed with the most extraordinary parents. Sadly, they have both been taken from my life. My mother's killer got away with murder, and my father's life has been taken by a failed justice system that convicted him of a crime that he did not commit." Jim spoke to the court for the first time during this same hearing. He read a prepared statement, which he closed by saying, quote, "To this day, it's still very difficult for me to talk about the circumstances that surrounded her death. All I see is Cathy with an axe in her head, and Sarah standing in the hallway disheveled, with an empty and distant look on her face. I did not murder Cathy. I love Cathy with all my heart and with all my soul." Sharon, Jim's current wife, also never believed that her husband, now of 23 years, could be a murderer. She said after the sentencing that they planned to appeal his guilty verdict, quote, "so that justice can truly and honestly be served." Nothing in their shared decades together led Sharon to believe that Jim had killed his first wife. Sharon later spoke about her relationship with Jim. She told 48 Hours that when she first reconnected with Jim, he was still devastated over Cathy's death and would get emotional when they spoke about it. She described her husband as honest and loving. Sharon continued to say that Jim was a decent and loving human being. When asked how she could be so sure that Jim was innocent, she said, quote, "When you're married to a man, you know his heart and you know his soul. Jim could never in this world do something so horrific."
Other women have been wrong.
It's true. We just never know.
Yeah.
Cathy's family felt differently. At first, they believed that Jim was innocent, but once the investigation was reopened and Jim was tried and found guilty, they believed that police got the right guy. Cathy's cousin, Susie, stated that this ordeal had been terrible, just awful. She also expressed that not only had Cathy been taken away from them, but so had Sarah. She had moved away with her father. About Jim, Susie stated, quote, "I know he did it. I know it was him." Cathy's father, who went by Bob, stated that he wasn't aware of any problems between his daughter and his son-in-law. After Jim was found guilty, Cathy's father requested that Cathy's remains be removed from the Krauseneck family lot. He wanted her brought home to be placed beside her mother and brother in Michigan, who both had since passed. According to findagrave.com, Cathy is buried in Michigan, so I assume her family was granted this request. If Jim did kill her, this was absolutely the right move. Cathy's father said afterwards to reporters outside of the courtroom, quote, "We got our justice. It took 40 years. Thank God we got it." Addressing a comment towards Jim, Cathy's father said, quote, "And Jim, I hope you live to be 100 years old and enjoy your new home," meaning his life in prison. However, Cathy's father would not get his wish to have his daughter's killer suffer decades more in prison. Jim would be dead just 6 months later.
What?
While in prison, Jim was diagnosed with esophageal cancer. His health declined rapidly, causing him to lose 80 pounds before his death. Jim Krauseneck died in prison on May 5th, 2023, so just last year. Sarah, Sharon, and Jim's legal team are still trying to appeal his verdict and clear his name. I couldn't find any updates as of yet, but I will keep you posted. And I will end with just a couple of more quotes after Jim's death. Jim's defensive lawyer stated, quote, "I was convinced that he was innocent back on March 1st, 1982, a few days after that murder, when I first met Jim and discovered this case with him. So my opinion hasn't changed one iota, and I feel very bad it has ended in this fashion." On the flip side of this, after Jim's death, Cathy's sister, Annette, stated, quote, "Even though Jim did not serve his full sentence, we believe that karma was done when he died an undignified death behind prison walls. The entire world knows that he killed my sister, and he died knowing that." The judge from Jim's case has stated that he has lost no sleep over Jim's guilty verdict. And finally, Cathy's father stated after Jim's death, quote, "I'm disappointed that he passed so early, but I hope he enjoys himself in hell." And that is the case of possible tunnel vision to solve one of the oldest cold cases in America, or it is the case of an utter dirtbag who viciously murdered his wife with an axe, left his daughter to spend the day with her dead body, and got away with literal murder for 40 years. The controversial possible dirtbag, James Frederick Krauseneck.
I'm not sure I'm going to help you on this one, Christie. Although I am leading to, he didn't do it.
My gut says that he didn't. I don't think there's any evidence to prove that he did.
There's not any evidence to prove one way or the other. So how do you make a determination on that?
Right. And just the fact that he was kind and gentle leading up to the murder and then lived the rest of his life still kind and gentle.
We had that priest that was kind and gentle
That's
and was
true.
receiving awards. Like, that doesn't sell it for me, but there's no motive and there's no concrete evidence.
Right. So how the heck in 2022, 2023 did this man have to go to prison? It's actually kind of unnerving to me that you could be convicted on the possibility of your shoe print being in a bag, not even proven, and one person's opinion of a time of death.
Over something they believe happened.
Right.
But there's no proof of.
No, when another officer said the blanket was not turned on, which would make that finding false.
Right. It's an interesting decision for the jury to come through. I can't say one way or the other that he's guilty or not, but I am shocked that they found him guilty.
Me too.
That is such a heartbreaking case for everyone involved.
Right. Because either way, there was no win in this.
No.
If Jim did do it, he did get away with it for 40 years, and he bamboozled everybody. And that's not right. He should have been incarcerated immediately. If he didn't, then her actual murderer got away with it. And I'm not convinced that Edward didn't kill her just because he got a few facts wrong.
They were pretty big facts.
They were big facts, but I do think it should have been looked into more.
Yes, definitely looked into more. I just feel for Sarah.
Yes.
This is awful.
It is awful. There was pictures of her hugging her dad in court. She showed up every day. She was in support. She 100% believes her father is innocent.
Just the extra trauma for her is very sad.
It is. And it would put this huge divide now between her and her mom's family.
Right. The rest of her support system.
Yep. She would have Sharon and her own family, but it would put her mother's family further away.
Mm-hmm.
Because when your grandfather says, "I hope he enjoys himself in hell," and you're grieving the death of your father and thinking he was wrongly convicted, that's not going to go over very well into building a good relationship.
Not at all. There are probably some pretty big bridges burned there.
Right. And when it comes down to it, it usually is the husband. And it could have been in this case, but I don't think he deserved to be convicted with the evidence that they had.
I am curious to what our listeners are going to think. please go on to our social platforms and let us know what you think about this case, because it seems like both Christie and I are on the fence for this one, which is an unusual scenario.
This is very unusual for me. I even struggled to call him a dirtbag because I just don't know if he is. But like Melissa said, we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram. Follow us there, and hopefully we can continue this conversation with you after the fact.
And we'll be back again next week with another case.
So until then,
see ya.
Bye. That's just life, baby.
I have to tell you, it's totally throwing me off. But there's two little things, like it's just the way that the mic is set with your teeth, that these two little like black things come down and it looks like you have like missing teeth. And so really it keeps like really distracting me. I can't look at you anymore.
I'm ugly. We're talking about how beautiful Cathy is. And then she's like, you got no teeth, woman.
I have to take a picture of it because it's like perfect.
Okay, take a picture. Maybe this will finally be like my photo reveal.
It's every little once in a while where it like blocks out your teeth.
Let's see. It is. Okay, so instead of a snack pantry, we need a dentist fund for Christie to get some teeth. Well, truth be told, you guys, I broke my mic. And so, and we don't have the fund quite yet to get a new one. And so it's in a weird position to make it close enough to my face.
And so now she looks different when I look across the table at her. She's got a flaccid mic.
I do have a flaccid mic. It won't stay strong and hold its position.
Nope.
When Melissa leaves, I should just switch the mics. Boy.
Sorry.
Just look at my eyes. My eyes are up here, Melissa.
I'll help you figure it out, Christie.
Okay. I don't like this fence sitting feeling. It's uneasy for me. I'm usually very confident in my feelings towards a case. By the time of this marriage in the early 1900s, 1990s.
Okay.
Thank you.
1900s?
He's a time traveler. Surprise!
Another Sound Off Media Company podcast.